Good morning, everyone. My name's Edith Podesta, and I'll be your moderator for today's Roundtable Dialogue, Body Language, presented by Centre 42 in collaboration with Esplanade Theatres on the Bay, or Esplanades Theatres on the Bay. So today, our dance focus will be the interplay between dance and text, the dramaturgy of choreography in contemporary performance. I'd like to start off by asking the panel members to introduce themselves, give you an idea of their praxis and their areas of research. So, Jonathan, if you'd like to begin.
Hello. My name is Jonathon Young, and I'm an actor and a playwright, and I work with Kid Pivot as a writer and co-creator of these dance theater works that we've been making for the past few years.
Good morning. Pawit Mahasarinand. I'm teaching in graduate programs in transdisciplinary approach in performing arts and cultural management at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. And also I'm writing for The Nation newspaper, which is the second oldest English language newspaper in Thailand. And occasionally I perform on stage as well. I'm currently in the production of art, like the comedy by Yasmina Reza, and we have been like touring to like provinces in Thailand for the past 7 months, and the tour will continue until the end of next year, like on and off. Yeah, but it's nice to be on stage sometimes. Yes, thank you, and nice to meet you. And Singapore is my second home. I usually come here like 2 or 3 times a year. Yes, I even, before COVID, I even had a Singaporean mobile phone number on Singtel, but it expired, of course, like during the lockdown. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm Renée Sigouin. I'm here in Singapore with Kid Pivot, performing in Revisor. I'm a dancer, performer based in Vancouver, and I work with Kid Pivot and a few other companies.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm Corrie. I started out as a critic, writing about performance, including theatre and dance, for about 10-15 years. So I started with the Straits Times. I've also written for The Guardian and Arts Equator. Currently I'm doing my PhD in theatre and performance, hopefully finishing up soon. But I also have started doing work, particularly in dance dramaturgy, which you'll probably hear a little bit about later. Yeah, that's me at the moment.
Well, welcome very early in the morning. We're so happy to have you here. So I thought we might start with the use of pre-existing narratives or narrative structures or text as a source material for creation, dance creation or movement creation. So Jonathan, can you start with the government inspector and revisor?
Sure. Have any of you seen the show, Revisor, that we're here? Yeah? Okay. So you'll know what I'm talking about. Yeah, so it's a dance theater piece, and Crystal Pite, the choreographer, and I had made another show called Betroffenheit, and then a short work called The Statement. So we had begun this process of working together and combining theater and dance. And when we knew we were going to make a new piece, we began with this idea of maybe exploring farce as a genre, and that came from our work on Betroffenheit. There was a show within a show in that piece, and we started talking about that particular brand of physical theater or physical comedy, and that it relies on a kind of cruelty or like an extreme form of behavior, and we thought that would lend itself well to dance. And I sort of set about looking for a farce that I could adapt, and came upon Nikolai Gogol's play The Government Inspector. I wasn't particularly familiar with that piece, but it seemed like the premise was something that was recognizable enough that we could play with it. And we knew from the beginning that if we were going to use this text, it would be also subverted and turned inside out, and we would want the audience to recognize fairly quickly what was going to happen, and maybe even have some familiarity with the premise. That's how we came upon that particular play. It wasn't because we knew it or liked it. It was just that it felt like a premise we could play with. And then the process was really me taking that play and seeing how I could reduce it and I guess somehow make the text speak to what was happening on stage. The fact that we have these performers who aren't actually speaking but are being moved by the speech. And so that there's some relationship between the play and the performers, that they are working inside it, or they are driven by it, or they are controlled by it, and that there's also some freedom within that, like their individual selves as dancers, their physical selves are in some kind of conflict with the play itself. And so we often saw the play as a kind of obstacle, or a regime, maybe, a structure that we would try to overthrow, perhaps, something along those lines.
And can I ask, are you, when you're reading the play or the original text, are you pulling bits verbatim, or are you adapting? Are you writing original work? How are you working with the text?
I was listening to the show last night, and there are only a few lines that were actually taken from the translation, like a handful of lines. So it really was trying to... I think I just read the play enough times that I really had a good sense of the structure, and then it was just thinking, how could that shape be preserved while getting rid of all the rest? And then only relying on lines when I couldn't, when I just needed something to sort of plug a hole almost. We went through a long process where the play was only going to be sort of one aspect of like a more polyphonic thing. And then gradually it was a process of reduction to get rid of these other aspects, and it just became this complex. In Gogol's play, it's a small town, and we chose complex so that it has a kind of like a psychological presence as well. And we embedded our inspector. In Gogol's play, the inspector is always sort of about to arrive, and then someone shows up at the end and announces, by the way, the inspector is here. And so there's this kind of mystery. Is the inspector there the whole time inspecting in disguise? And we thought, well, maybe the inspector is somehow inside it, or maybe the play is the kind of disguise for this sort of internal inspection. Yeah.
Did you pay particular attention to physical direction in the play, or stage direction? Did you pay particular attention also to like words that were very physical in the text?
Certainly, I constantly think of words that are about physicality. And in Gogol's play, it ends in this tableau. Right, it's very like there's a stage direction which indicates that these officials who have been caught are frozen at the end for like, I don't know how, I can't remember how long he says, but it's like a very specific amount of time, and they're sort of locked in these positions of anticipation and question, and they hold this pose as the curtain comes down in anticipation of justice finally arriving, or change finally occurring. That was something that we kept. Other than that, I don't think so. But for me, it's always interesting if the language is always talking about the physicality that's happening. So it is like a process of thinking of, what will have like a rhythmic feel to it, so that it will be fun to move to, or it suggests a kind of percussion or rhythm. And Crystal, as kind of my co-writer, editor, dramaturg, is always attentive to that as well. Yeah.
And in working with Crystal, we were talking last night in the post-show dialogue about, you said that you left a hole in the middle of the structure. Can you talk about that hole? And is that hole in the text, or, first act, second act hole, was that something that you intended to have as an opening for choreography, or was that something that you wanted to play with as a writer, using movement as language?
A bit of both, but when we began rehearsals, there was no writing there. It got to the play got to a certain point, and then it picked up again. And that was really because at some point it feels like my job as the writer has to follow the dance so that its expressive power is as essential as the text. And so then it was my job as kind of like the writer-inspector to sort of watch what they were doing in rehearsal and in a way try to inspect it or to describe it as though I was watching evidence flying by and trying to capture as it was going by what I could as I was watching it. And so that part of the rehearsal process, it was just like reams and reams and reams of writing that we just sort of sifted through and went, well, that kind of that's the most succinct description of that piece of movement. And it was like trying to identify, I guess, little like words that had resonance. And so it was that kind of thing. And the whole was really left, I mean, what I love about the play is that this guy who shows up in this town and he gets just absolutely wasted. They give him all this vodka to make him tell the truth and say who he is, but it doesn't work. And he passes out. But it's sort of in that night that when he wakes up in the morning, he has this decision of what he's going to do, and he's going to expose these people for who they really are. And so he's going to take this corrupt, cruel system and he's going to sort of show it to the world. So he almost becomes like a kind of whistleblower, like he infiltrates this situation and then he describes it to the outer world. It's like word gets out about what's going on here. And it just seemed like that was kind of a good point to maybe in this sort of weird hallucinogenic night where he's been he's become somebody else. That seemed like a good point to sort of turn the show into a kind of dream or hallucination or something. Or to open it up so that we could maybe explore its subconscious.
Thank you. Renée, how did you work with the text? Did you get the audio recording? Did you get to see a copy of the text? How does that work as a dancer?
So I had
She was there from the very beginning.
Yeah, the pleasure and privilege of being there. Like Jonathon did a table read with not the cast that ended up doing all of the voiceovers, but sort of an original sort of test run.
We thought that those were the cast, but then we made changes.
And then some of them got switched out.
Yeah.
But so I heard John's original version of the farce script, and I was sitting there listening to the actors performing it, and they're all such unique characters in the way that they use their voices. Like, for example, Nikki, I heard her read her part. Nikki plays Minister D'Souza, and she has such a very like a unique raspy kind of dark tone. And then I was talking to her in the kitchen after, and then she was using her normal voice, and I was just so thrown by it. But so I heard that first sort of table read, and I was kind of listening to how John structures his dialogue, and it's like very easy as a dancer to picture how the text is being sort of thrown back and forth between the characters, and also John always uses these words and sentences and like idioms that have double meanings that you can interpret as physical directions. So there's like the specific characters that you can hear in the sort of tone and characterization of the voices that immediately gives you inspiration for like how to sort of put a character on into your body stylistically. And then there's the percussive and rhythmic nature of the dialogue, and then these kind of double meanings that imply maybe a literal interpretation that you could do. So I heard that, but also prior to that, I was familiar with, I had seen the statement, and I had understudied Betroffenheit, so I had sort of tried on that style of interpreting the dialogue already. But as John said, the characters in this piece were kind of like just very extreme, the most extreme versions of themselves. Whereas in Betroffenheit, all of the characters were kind of these elements of John's voice and John's mind. So in the very beginning, after that table read, we did a residency at the Banff Center, and it was just myself and another dancer and the technical team, and John and Crystal. And so I was trying on a few characters, they were all sitting out in the audience, and they would play the text, a few recordings, and I would just kind of do stuff, just kind of like get thrown into action.
And
so
you were
we
kind
were
of everybody at that
yeah,
point.
I was the director. I remember we were doing that first scene with the crazy laugh into a backbend. So that was one of the first things, and it actually stayed in the show.
You've been like every person in the show. Yeah, you could perform. Renée could perform any of them.
But Crystal talks about text or language as like an animating force, and so I think John sort of touched on this when he was talking about like the farce as a force that acts on the dancers. And then, so as a dancer in this process, I was always kind of asking myself, no matter which character I was playing, like what are the forces acting on me coming from the narrator or the structure of the farce, and then like what are the forces coming from inside of me springing me into sort of like action. And then there's also an element of in the middle section where the text becomes more psychological. And this is something I think that like that sort of internal dialogue is something that I always have, even if it's not the text that's being spoken, is something that I sort of an internal score that I create for myself. So what, for example, like, what is she saying? No, too soon.
Right.
Just decides, like these sort of things. So I use that type of thing to interpret the character stuff as well, especially when I'm playing Misha, the character who doesn't
speak. The silent
speak.
one, yeah.
And for Misha, John and I have had discussions about like one time I asked him, does Misha know that she's in the farce or
Is she
or
aware?
not?
Yeah.
And I think it's fun for me as a performer to play with different levels of like getting sort of completely taken by the farce and having that inform my physicality, where I'm sort of swept away with all the other characters, and then also certain moments where I feel more connected to the voice of the narrator and I feel sort of outside of it and observing and questioning what the other characters are doing.
Yeah, it's interesting that that character has a kind of freedom, even though she has no agency. She doesn't speak. She doesn't seem to participate in the way that, or can't participate, as kind of like an outsider or like a true insider.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we almost forget sometimes that Misha's even there.
Yeah.
And then we remember, oh, right, she's
Yeah.
there observing and making stuff happen. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Pawit about how have like contemporary dancers moved with, like parallel to, or away from the Ramekin?
Last night as a post-show discussion, I was amazed by your response that before like taking on this project you had not like read like the Inspector General. Yeah, so I think this is the exact opposite to how Ramayana have influenced like dance traditions in this part of the world. Like we all have read like Ramayana and all versions of it, and it had been ingrained in the soul and the body of like people working in the arts, and also the general public as well. I mean, if you were like from this part of the world, it's like like we have to eat rice, or we have to eat curry, or we have to eat like noodles. Like we cannot get away with it. And so I think it varies from like one country to another, like how rigid, I mean, the training like is, and then you have I think Pichet Granchun, the classically trained dancer and choreographer from Thailand, once said that the definition of like contemporary dance like vary like from one culture to another culture, and he said that in Bangkok, at a post-show discussion we had a Southeast Asian project which was funded by the Goethe Institute, and it's 555. So the Goethe Institute invited 3 contemporary dance companies from Thailand, Cambodia, and Indonesia to work on the same scene, the same episode of Ramayana, and they presented it like for 20 minutes, like amazingly like different. Then when you look at the Cambodian like version of it, like for a lot of people, it still looks like very traditional. So in certain like culture, if you like bend like one rule, it's not traditional. It's already contemporary. But then in other countries, you have to like go like very far away from the original in order to be considered contemporary. So I think that's it depends. But of course, like we all want to get away from the like hegemony, I mean, from the tradition, from the oppression or the suppression. I'm being too political now. The election is next Sunday in Thailand. But then again, we like for example in Thailand, if like a company want to like donate money to support the arts, they have to donate directly to the Ministry of Culture. So you cannot like you cannot like donate. Well, of course you can donate to the companies, but you will not get the tax refund benefit. Okay, so in other words, the Ministry of Culture control what's being like presented like on the stage. Yeah.
What stories we can tell? Are they controlling the stories that we can tell, and how?
Well, yeah, that's true. And then a recent astonishing case was about 2 years ago. The Ministry of Culture even stripped the title of a national artist. He's a writer. Yeah. So they stripped the title because he was too critical of the government. Yeah. And then in Thailand, as a national artist, you get a salary as well. You get a salary, you get the healthcare benefits, and you get official passport, of course. Yes, that's that too. So that's how it is, and hopefully it will change next Sunday.
We have hope. Corrie, can you please talk about the creation process of Mimpi, or loading and unloading?
So I think today I'll talk about loading, unloading, because I think Mimpi is still in quite a nascent process. I see a couple of
jumping ahead.
Mimpi artists here, and we're still working on it. So I'm going to talk about the work of Prisma, which is a dance company in Singapore. It's a Malay minority dance company. Their tagline is Malay is a concept, dance is a strategy, which I really love. And I've written about Prisma's work for quite a few years before they invited me on board to take on a writer-in-residence role with them, which is quite a shape-shifting role. It's sometimes being like an embedded critic, sometimes being like a text dramaturg. So I quite like moving between these positions. So loading, unloading was kind of the first formal relationship we had as a writer writing with and for Prisma, which was a really enjoyable process. So maybe I'll talk about writing about dance later, but today I'll talk about the kinds of narratives that Prisma uses in their work, maybe using narrative in a more expanded sort of way. So Loading Unloading is the first time Prisma was commissioned to do to be part of a visual art exhibition at the Singapore Art Museum, which is temporarily now located at the Tanjong Pagar District Park, which is right in front of one of the port in Singapore. And of course, the port is a huge part of Singapore's economic identity, which is something that Prisma was very interested in interrogating through their bodies, thinking about labor around the port. So they kind of took that as a point of embarkation. So I'm going to talk about two kinds of narratives maybe that we looked at in the process, one a more macro narrative and one very much more micro. So Prisma enjoys inviting in kind of researchers or subject matter experts in the first phase of their creation process, where they really kind of expand or wander down as many themes or thematic interests as possible before becoming a lot more focused in their scope. So we invited in the architectural historian, Dr. Imran Tajuddin, who is just phenomenal. He's an incredible academic, to really talk about histories of maritime labor and also naming and mapping, right, in the Southeast Asian archipelago or the Malay archipelago or the Nusantara in particular. And when he was kind of talking to us during that first lecture with all the dancers in, all the creative team, the sound designer, set designer, he really spent a lot of time thinking, how do we map this part of the region and the connections between sites through import, export, trade, not just in the contemporary era, but even during the colonial era and also pre-colonial. And we were very interested in thinking, how do we shift the narrative of this region told through maps, right, which the Europeans did a lot. They mapped us in all kinds of directions. How do you, I think one of his first invocations to us was, how do we peel away from a Eurocentric story and really rethink the connections we have with other sites in this area. And he kind of invoked the Malay term for map, which is beta, but also talked about its Javanese etymology, which is betha or pepethan, which can mean shape, imagination, visualization, idea, notion, concept, and mode of action. So mode of action was most interesting to us. How can we remap this site through the body as a mode of action? And that really was a question that I think lingered with us and the performers as they thought about how their bodies would interrupt. You see their bright yellow kind of costumes, the very, very invisible labor that was taking place at this site. So there was kind of broader decolonial histories that we were thinking about. And then in terms of a much more micro history, we did an interview with a prime mover driver at the port. So all of us gathered and he kind of shared what his work was like every day as a prime mover driver in this massive, sprawling space. We actually got PSA Singapore to drive us around the port. We couldn't take any pictures, unfortunately, but it was an experience. And he this prime mover driver, whom I'll call S, he really talked about the enormous sense of isolation, just driving for 12 hours a day just alone in his booth, and just trying to keep himself from boredom so he won't fall asleep, because accidents can really be fatal when you're driving like massive containers. And so you see in this image, you see 4 radios in front of the structure. And he said he would often refer to his radio as his best friend. He would anthropomorphize his radio that accompanied him throughout his day. And he would often sing karaoke by himself in his little booth. But every single prime mover in Singapore is installed with an anti-drowsiness device. So it's a little camera that is focused on the driver at all times that can pick up the biometrics of your face and see if you're falling asleep. And if you're falling asleep, you're yawning, or you're showing signs of sleepiness, they'll know in the control room and make sure you're awake. So they're under constant surveillance as well. And so he says sometimes when he's singing karaoke, he'll like yell really loudly, and then it looks like he's yawning, and the supervisor will be like, "Are you falling asleep? Are you awake?" So no, I'm just singing. So we took both these narratives, I think the broader scale of the narrative that Imran was talking about, but also these tiny mini stories. So the radio plays a big part in the soundscape of the work. Here you can see a close-up. In the ways in which I think the show intervenes in different sites. So this is just one of the site-specific activations that he did. We also did it in one of the cargo lifts. And what was interesting is that the lift broke down, so we actually had to get a lift technician to come fix it. And then he was so fascinated by the show that he stayed on to watch literally what kind of us emulate the kind of work he was doing. So I think maybe I'll stop there for now. You can ask more questions. Yeah.
I think, you were talking about personal narratives, so I think I might tie that to a question that I have about source materials. So we've been talking about narratives, but creating from original text or physical scores or research materials, imagery. But this personal text, I mean, Jonathon, you dealt with that in Betroffen Height. Can you talk about that or Parade and the Statement, about using maybe personal narratives or an incident, event, and then using that as an entry point into creation?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Betroffen Height was the first time that I had done that. Currently in Canada, it seems to be a sort of prominent mode, I would say, is to use personal experience and to turn it into theater. And there's a real trend right now of almost kind of like confessional work and sort of eliminating the barrier between performance and audience and really trying to say, hey, it's me and this is my story, and a kind of focus on that. I'm slightly allergic to that, I would say, and I don't gravitate towards it as an artist, but this show was about a personal experience, and I was as interested in the self and the various events that occur within a self that has been, I don't know, fractured or broken or is dealing with some sort of like cataclysmic event. And I was interested in seeing if the stage could be that self, could stand in as me, for example. And I mean, our approach to that was to kind of like, I would say, inflict the stage with a disorder, like a post-traumatic disorder. And we were looking at text as kind of one force, the conversation and as an approach, like as a mode of action, and that kind of strange thing where we always consider the language as kind of like the primary mode of action. It drives us, and it influences behavior, and narratives become entrenched. So that was one force in our show. And then there's the physical self that is very much a part of that and also totally separate from it. That's kind of how that show came about.
Because the title means, having no words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a mysterious word, and there's no direct translation for it in English, and that was one of the reasons why it seemed like the right title for me. It was that it was naming an experience that couldn't be named. It was like approaching something. It was approaching a kind of frontier where language failed, and it also, the Betroffen Heights, that like had a kind of explosive quality to it too. Yeah.
Because I remember, I'm interested to know how you introduce the subject matter of that personal experience to the dancers. Because I remember when I saw it, in the UK. I didn't read anything about it. I just bought my tickets. I turned up at Sadler's Wells and I was like, okay, great. I want to have
That's the best way to show
I know.
up. Yeah.
But the problem is that midway through the show, I find myself being emotionally like tortured and not knowing why. And I'm like, wait, what is this show about? I like crying, but I don't understand why. And I was obsessed. When I left, I was like, I have to read up everything now. So then how was it? What was the process of introduction, the creation process, when it's your personal event and you're working, with this idea that you cannot describe this tragedy?
Yeah.
There are no words.
And I was also, I deliberately kept the specifics of the backstory out of the show. Because I think out of respect for the backstory in some ways, right? Because I didn't feel like I wanted to use it in that way, and yet there was still, it felt like, I was the person who was going through that event, and so it was my own content, but at the same time, it was much bigger than me, so I had to approach it carefully and with respect, and
you were on stage.
And I was on stage too, yeah. It was a kind of horrifying thing that I put myself into. But I guess I was interested in the kind of obliteration of self, or getting past that. And also, the unlike Revisor, where we have a cast of voice actors, it would, like Renée said, it was just my voice. So we were able to kind of adjust as we went along. I would just make recording after recording after recording as we worked. And so I was sort of the self at the center of it, and I was also just a performer doing a job. It was kind of like crazy making, but it was also an interesting and very valuable thing to do. It was incredibly hard, but it was also kind of nice to be freed from it, and to show up and to just have to go through a series of moves, and sort of to go through this labyrinth that all plays are, where you there's the moment you begin, and then you go through this crazy series of steps. You get lost in it. If you're on a good night, you kind of almost wake up and it's over because you've been inside it, and you forget. You forget about time, you forget about yourself, you forget about all the things that you're constantly preoccupied with during the day. So it's like an hour and a half of kind of freedom from the self. And there's something beautiful about that. I guess that's what becoming super present is all about, right? Is becoming detached from who you are and those voices inside that are always with you.
What heavy subject matter to want to spend, an hour and a half revisiting.
It came to a point though where it felt like its own thing. The show took on a life of its own. So I just had to play a traumatized guy. It was like I was showing up to play a version of myself. Yeah.
And can I ask, Renée, when you work with a choreographer, do you work outside of text as well with another type of text? Like, for instance, we were talking about maps before. Do you work with physical imagery in place of text? Do you work with sounds? Do you, is there a set of instructions rather than a narrative that you work with? What are the different types of physical scores you would work with in terms of creation, movement creation?
There's so many.
Yeah, I
know. As a performer, I'm really interested in work that sort of intersects in physical theater and dance theater. And so that's mostly what I've been doing for the last 10 years. And everyone that I work with has a different approach. So with one company that I work with, Out Inner Space, one of the choreographers, Tiffany Tregarthen, really loves to work with sort of psychological statements, and so we will work and build sequences of movement or motifs that really have like a psychological sort of DNA. And
can you give an example?
So, an example, just something as simple as like, never mind. and what's a sequence that, or several of these statements in a row that can influence sort of a rhythmic sequence of movements. And then also, you mentioned sounds. I think something I was going to mention earlier was that the way something is edited can really influence like a state that you can create, even if there's already a set piece of movement or if it's improvised. An example, in Revisor, like in the middle section, the way some of the text has been edited is really layered and on top of itself and sort of relentless, and this can sort of, as a dancer, I can take that and sort of interpret it in my body as being kind of tugged in multiple directions at once, and sort of like the tension between being pulled and wanting something else, or yeah. So I think psychological states coming from text and sound influence a lot of how I work with movement in terms of improvisation or creating movement or interpreting choreography. I've also worked with performing text in like a more abstract way where the text is not necessarily narrative or directly related to the movement, but more kind of influencing the mood or a general feeling in the overall work. Yeah. When we're working with text with Crystal and John, one of the big ways that we have been working is like very literally illustrating the sort of tone and texture and rhythm of the text. So we will try to insert as much detail as we can, as precisely as we can, starting and stopping, showing this sort of dynamic of the text. And I think at one point in rehearsal, John sort of started to realize that it was also interesting to sort of shift that relationship where like the movement doesn't align with the text exactly or at all. And so I think there's like a really wide spectrum of how we can physically work with that relationship between words and choreography.
Yeah, it's kind of endless.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
We'll
we're happy
keep
that it
working
is.
on
Yes,
that. Yeah.
yes, thank you. More shows, more shows. Now, Pawit, can I ask about any examples from the extensive interviews that you've done with dancers in Thailand, like Chompi's interest in Franz Kafka, for instance, as an entry point into creating?
Well, I think in the case of Gigi Chompi, it's quite unique. I mean, in the sense that he started to become interested in Franz Kafka's work, and then he adapted it into a contemporary dance work, and then he started a festival called Unfolding Kafka Festival. Yeah, which, I mean, well, come to think of it, like Kafka wrote about almost everything, right? So it can be anything, right? This festival can be anything. So it's like Unfolding Shakespeare. It can be, which is like a smart title. Anyway, so it's a biannual contemporary dance and visual art, yeah, like in Bangkok and Chiang Mai. And so I think I'm sure that he hasn't read like all the Kafka's works, but he's interested in like certain works and certain themes. And then he created his own work. So, and I think it's like an entry point, like in a sense, like to try to like connect it to your work and also to your audience. So when the work is performed like overseas, at least like Westerners or like Europeans or Americans or Canadians like know like Kafka, and then there's an element of Thai traditional dance into it, so that you feel that you know something about it, and then you're curious what is this creation, yeah, is like. And then I think when I watched the reviser last night, I also felt this this creative freedom like in the work because unlike here in this region, I mean not only Southeast Asia but I think in Asia in general, we are quite confined like by the separation, like for example between dance and theater. So in other words, like if you're trained in a dance school, you're not supposed to speak. Just dance, just move. And then if you're trained in a theater school, then you don't know how to move, which is like for me it's totally unnatural because like we as a human being, we speak like naturally, we move like naturally. So and we'll come to think of it in our traditional performing arts, dance, theater, and music had always been together. And then what? Colonization, and then we started to separate like the dance, like dancers from the musician, from the theater artists, and now like those European and American countries, they're bringing them back again. So I think it's time for us as well, right, to come back like together and like see how. Like for example, Pichet Kanchun, he's a very good actor as well. He is a very good singer as well, even though I mean, like he doesn't sing in his performance. And then if you think of his most like known work, Pichet Kanchun and myself, it's theater, right? Like these two dancers, they show to us that they had just met, and they repeated it like over and over again, like more than 150 times, like all over the year. They're acting, and they're talking about like their work. So, I think it's important. Yeah, I think it's important to just like get back to this creative freedom. I think that is I think it's important for development of of the contemporary arts like here in Southeast Asia.
The freedom to pull from any genre, from any work of art.
And then I think the freedom to just like create your work from anything, and then use any possible mode that you can, or collaborate like with people who have different training or different practice, like so that just to make sure that you can get your point across like to your audience. You don't have to be confined. And come to think of it, I mean, the trend worldwide now is that festivals are changing names. So you see less. I mean, like you see like fewer like genre specific like festivals, right? Like theater festival, dance festival, but you see like more arts festival or like something like Unfolding Kafka. It can be anything, right? You see more than that because that's the zeitgeist of, especially like after COVID. Yeah, we all is it after COVID? We still during COVID, right?
What's COVID?
What's COVID? And we realized that we are closer like to each other and different fields, right? Like before COVID, we did not even know what PPE is, right? Yeah, but now we all know like PPE. It's a medical term, right? PPE, but now we all know. Do you know? Yes. Yeah. You didn't, right? And so yes, I think it's important to. For educational like institutions to be aware of this and make sure that, of course, you want to be trained fully in each field, but you cannot decline the relationship like among all the fields, and also the arts and the science and the society as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Corrie, can I come back to you with the maritime histories and movements, like the performance of the human, the organic movements that you found when you were doing your tour, that you have no evidence for because, you know, it's very secret. But can we talk about machine, organic labor, how you were using that as source material?
Okay, I might.
You can answer the question in any way you want.
Yeah, I might actually. So I know I've talked a little bit about loading, unloading, and actually I might respond maybe with a different work, if
Please
that's
do.
okay.
Yeah.
And I'm a bit nervous because there are a few tactility studies people here, but I'm going to talk about tactility studies, which is a long-term project that I've been dramaturg for, and actually the co-creator is in the audience. So it's a long-term performance project by theatre and dance artists Chong Gua Ki and Bernice Lee, and it really comes out from this, what they call the exploration of the body as theatre. So it's very much thinking about the body as a kind of site for source material for this work. And really is an invitation began as an invitation in 2019 when we first started, for audience members to really open up their bodies as the site for performance, right? How do we were very interested in thinking, how is a body read? How do we read each other's bodies and body languages? How do we develop competencies and fluencies and literacies in the ways in which we connect with each other? And because it was, I think they started the exploration in 2018, they got me on board in 2019. So the kind of Me Too backdrop was very strong during this period. And we were thinking a lot about what is transgressive touch? How do we read touch in that way? What is reparative and pleasurable touch? And so the first work that we did, actually Adele is here also, yes. The first work that we did was in December 2019, not knowing the impending pandemic that was upon us. It's a very touch-based work where audience members like G here is just being caressed by the various performers. And we're thinking about how we build consent into the ticketing or invitation process where audience members sign up to either participate or observe, like, I don't want to be touched at all, right? So the body very much became source material, even during workshops where we were workshopping in various phases. Some of the exercises would include, because this is kind of based on a score, we brought in like conversational scores, or maybe workshops would begin with, how do we think of the word brew, B-R-E-W? How does that unfold in the way we connect with each other physically? And then the pandemic happened, and it's very hard to do a piece about touch when touch is being pathologized. So we went through a lockdown as many other countries did as well. And it was very interesting to me as a kind of academic and observer of this work to think about how the work was not just being choreographed by the body or the bodies of the audience members we invited into the space, but that the state was also a choreographer of us. We have an Infectious Diseases Act in Singapore that have very strict guidelines around gathering, and it really looks like a score, right? Must be 2 meters apart, and the guidelines for live performance were changing like every week. Like we didn't even know if like the show would open. We had to adhere to some, like, performers have to be behind a screen, how many meters away, like, do they wear masks? Do they not wear masks? Can the soles of people's feet be touched? Like, all these things we had to think about, which were very stressful and in the weeks leading up to this work. So the second kind of iteration or branch of tactility studies took place just after our phase 2 heightened alert. Yeah, with so many phases in Singapore. And you can see here that Bib is performing behind a screen. We had a designated chair where audience members could sit. And it really felt, like our bodies were being oddly we're adhering to interesting kind of social choreographies of the state as we were also choreographing this work. So it was interesting to think of in retrospect now, the Infectious Diseases Act being a kind of source text for or the different guidelines for live performance that we were adhering to, also being a kind of source text or paratext for the choreographies that were taking place. And also, I guess in terms of literal text, one thing very important to tactility studies is the invitation we extend to audience members and the kind of disposition that they have when they enter a space, how they make acquaintance with a space or the performers. And often there's this little invocation or invitation that that is in text, that is kind of incorporated into the piece. And often there'll be a kind of conversational score post-show to the work. It's not really a post-show, it's really kind of part of the work as well. I don't know if it's answering your question. I'm rambling.
No, you're not rambling. It's all gorgeous. Please continue. This is great. No. Please feel free to disregard my questions, or you could just go off and dance if you want. I'm happy for anything. It's all good.
Yeah.
But speaking of talking about dance, a word, a sound, a movement, a score dictated by the government. There's this idea that at the end of a meal, we might say, we can't write about music, for instance, because it's a language unto itself. You can't criticize music. How can you even encapsulate music when it's, it doesn't have words, it's a sound, it's a feeling. But how do we write about dance? So I wanted to ask the two reviewers, critics, dramaturgs on the panel, and then if you have any ideas about how we write about a very physical medium.
Can I respond?
Of course.
Actually, that's interesting because I think the reason why Bernice and Guaki invited me to join tactility studies was because of the way I wrote about movement and dance. So I don't know if this is specific to me as a person, but I really enjoy writing about gesture and movement. And something I think they said about my writing, which I wasn't aware of, is that they said it was very tactile and very sensorial. And I've been trying to think about why that's the case. And I don't know if this is unique to, I'm sure people, I only found out very recently that not everyone experiences emotions physiologically, which was very shocking to me, because I experience things very physiologically, and I realized some people do and some people don't, after informally polling people. But when I watch shows, or even if I have encounters in my daily life, I'm very aware that I embody emotion very extremely. So I often describe watching a show to me as a critic as I feel like a big tuning fork. I feel like I'm vibrating with a show, and I will feel the emotions of people on stage or that I'm watching extremely deeply in my body. I can tell you my heart is literally aching, or my fingers tingle. It's almost like synesthesia. So I often feel that when I'm watching a work, I am embodying the work and I can have very strong physical reactions to a piece, not just cry, feel very shaken by something. And then when I come out of that, I try to capture that feeling in the writing. So that is how I write about dance. And so I focus a lot on these kinds of bodily experiences, whether it's sweat, or observing sweat, or breath, or if I'm sitting on concrete, the sensation of concrete, just trying to capture a lot of sensations in text so that you also feel my text crawling through your body. Something like that.
Yeah, I've experienced that reading your work, and so it's really interesting that you feel that you are a tuning fork, because reading your critique, I also feel a resonance, that I feel the same kind of, and then that's really interesting. Do I want to go to this show or not, depending on your review, depending on how I feel?
Yeah, and I think maybe one more thing is that I also like that there are textures in language, so I will pick words with certain shapes or sounds or textures, or they have a crunch to them. Often I will write a sentence and I'll swap out certain words so that the cadence or the shape will sit in your body or your mind in a certain way. I've never talked about this in my life. This is really weird. So that it will create a certain kind of emotional residue. Yeah. So I think of language as a kind of architecture also. Yeah.
I have experienced your residue.
This is a very weird experience.
No, it's great. And do you write in the same way when you're watching a performance? How do you capture that for an audience who will, you know?
It's a little different, yes. But I'm listening to Corrie, and it reminds me of news I read last week in Los Angeles. An audience member attending a LA Philharmonic had a
An orgasm.
Yes. I think she's from Singapore. I'm sorry, I'm just kidding. That's a joke. But I'm just like really appreciate like when people like get a like special response. Or,
it's very much
like,
worth the ticket
experience,
price, I think.
Experience like towards a performance, a live performance. And this morning, a newspaper was delivered to my hotel room, and I was in the toilet and reading a newspaper, and I realized that this is the first time in like 3 months that I put my hands on a newspaper. So I think that's how like we like writers like have to consider like we don't write for print like newspapers anymore. Most of us don't write for print newspapers anymore, and so when we write like online, we have to keep in mind that there are different ways to convey like to the readers. So in other words, like online you can write like as long as you want, like in many cases. And you can put as many images, as many photos or video clips or interviews or anything. It's just a new way of communication, and I think that's a new way of writing, like arts review, like as well. And then you have to keep in mind that many of the things that you're trying to describe, like what happened in the theater, the video clip, like or the photos, like in your like online article, can do that job for you. So you don't want to repeat that. So you write about like something else. So I think like well usually in criticism we talk about the three like main elements like description, analysis, and judgment. So I think like with the online mode we can cut down on the description, and we can move on to analysis and judgment. Yeah, so that's I think that's how we adapt, and then I think with the digital world, with an online mode, it's easier to connect with other things. Like you can do the hypertext, the link and everything. That would it's a different way of reading a review and also a writing a review. I mean I have a I always think that a great work is a great work, but then there must be a reason like why you bring like this great work of art for us to view in a specific place at a specific time. So in other words, like why like Revisor like now here in Singapore, Asian premiere, and then I've heard that it's continued to Taipei and Yokohama as well, like later on. I mean, like why do Asians need to see like Revisor now? Yeah, so I think it's, and also an Inspector General, yeah, which it would be like hilarious if this were like in Thailand, because Singapore and Thailand are total opposite in terms of corruption. In terms of so I realized last night that I was in the Inspector General as well, as a college student when I was junior, but you cut my character out of your adaptation.
I'm so sorry.
It's one of the two I think businessmen or millionaires,
sort of
Bob Chinsky and Dobzhinsky. They do it. Yeah, you cut them out.
I'm sorry.
So
Time for a rewrite.
And interestingly, in the Thai adaptation, the director is now the national artist of Thailand now. Yeah, not the one who got like stripped of his title, but the Thai title is Corruption, which sounds like corruption. Yeah. But corrupt is like krap. It's like the word that we put like at the end of a sentence to make it like polite. Yes, yeah. So yeah, I think like this work would like resonate a lot like with the Thai audience. Yeah. And so I think I have a tendency to connect it to connect a work of art to something else, and also there's a certain requirement like by the publication as well. I mean the online magazine and newspaper as well. Even though I'm reviewing the work that I'm watching overseas, I have to make it like somehow connected to the Thai readers, so that they have a reason like to read, like somehow, or compare it to a Thai work or a Thai politics or something that would interest, I mean, the readers. Yeah, but of course there are like dance. Criticism like journals where you have to write like differently. So I think it depends on like where you publish like your writing. And I don't have a Facebook. I don't have Facebook. Yeah, I don't have Facebook. I don't have Instagram. Yeah, so it's like my reviews have become like the social media posts. Yeah, I have too many secrets.
Thank you for sharing them today. I have one more question that I'd like to ask the panel, and then I'm going to open it up to you. So if you would like to ask a question, have a think over the next 5 minutes or so, put up your hand and a microphone will be given to you because we're recording this session. I really want to ask Renée about the training of a dancer. In the training, as we were saying before, do you move into text? Do you look at breath? Do you look at articulation as well as physical articulation? Are you looking at the choreography of the mouth, of language?
I would say in my training I did, definitely. I worked with improvising with spoken text. I've done a little bit of voice work in my dance training, breath work. Interpreting physical scores in terms of, as a dancer, creating your own movement or improvising. And like in terms of interdisciplinary practice, I would say, like, I grew up training in classical piano and singing. I don't sing very much. I don't sing. I'm not a very good singer.
You sing?
No, I don't. That's why I took singing lessons, but it's really bad.
Next piece.
No. The dancer who can't sing.
But wants to and tries.
So I think actually, like, I've always been interested in this way of performing, even though most of my training and practice is dance. And then I would consider sort of like all of the work that I sort of, my trajectory as a performer, I would also consider that part of my training, because with every project there's sort of like a figuring out of new skills or new ways to interpret an idea. And so I would say, like, I've worked with sort of influence of clowning, sort of masking with the face, and I've worked with spoken text in performance, and so most of my training was dance, but I would say my interest and the training that I was able to access did have influence from text and theater.
Fantastic. And then, Jonathon, what kind of advice would you give to the writers in the room who have never done any dance if they want to collaborate with a dancer or a choreographer? How do you bridge that gap?
I think I sort of see my job as creating context for abstraction without spelling everything out. I mean, I'm interested in contemporary dance because of the power of abstraction or pure poetry. And when I'm watching a piece of contemporary dance, I notice that I'm always asking, who are these people and what are they doing and where are they? And I love that there's no answer or there's multiple answers. But if the answer was, well, they're these people and they're doing this with each other and they're in this place, then it's lost it's no longer abstract and it's tipped into narrative. And so I'm interested, though, in providing enough context that the audience then has an access point to read abstraction in a certain way without sort of stealing that power or explaining it away, I guess. And so I think that feels like the kind of work that Crystal and I and the company are doing is, we're working with abstraction and figuration and we're trying to sort of bring them together, but they also still have their autonomy. And so we fail, I think, when one or the other becomes redundant or illustrative. Something is said and now we show it. And so it's like, we'll either do one or the other kind of thing, right? And it's looking, I am constantly looking for those moments of redundancy where something has just become illustrative. Yeah.
Thank you. Who would like to ask any of our panel members a question? Just put up your hand and we'll give you a microphone. If not, I could continue asking questions for the rest of the morning. Any burning questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for the dialogue. Is really great and really inspiring. Text and movement, they're both sort of forms of language of expression, and I think in all languages, when you translate one to the other, there are some things that might get lost. As a writer's perspective, what are some things that you've seen that have gone lost in translation? Or from a dancer's perspective, what are some things that you are expressing through your movement that just can't be captured by text? Just to explore.
It's for all of the panel members.
Who's going to take it?
You can all take it. You've got time.
At once.
Let's do it. Then
Yeah.
it'll be like the yeah.
Something that's lost in translation?
But do you even see that? Do you experience some things where you write it and you see it move and it just, something cannot be expressed through movement, it has to be written like that?
I mean, I'm certainly very interested in that as a subject matter. Like with language trying to approach something that can't be put into language. I'm interested where things fail and trying to fail better. I'm coming up pretty short here.
No, maybe I'll jump in.
I'm interested where things fail, like me, as a panelist.
I really love what you said, Jonathan, about providing context for abstraction. I think that could be used in multiple contexts. I think you do it, I guess, in the writing with dance. But I feel very similarly of that failure to capture. I think the attempt is what is most exciting. Mm-hmm. That when I try to write about or with movement or dance, I think maybe I use movement more broadly because I wouldn't call all the stuff I do with artists like dance work. I know that I inhabit a different territory or I speak a different language from the body. So all I can do is give you a certain landscape or snapshot or long exposure of a thing, and that is what I can do adjacent to the thing itself. And then the both of them combined give you the experience of the work. So it's not just that, so I feel like they work in tandem. I was very inspired by an academic article written by this guy called Theron Schmidt, who says how we talk about the work is the work. And that really blew my mind because then I think, writing can be an extension of someone's encounter with a piece or extend the lifespan of a work in different kinds of conversational contexts, whether in text or like you're just talking to someone after the show about a piece. And I'm like, oh, how can I contribute to this ecology of discourse about a piece? Then it became quite exciting to play with how something can be written with or about that feels like a coda or little satellites of text around a work. So I don't feel like I'm competing or trying to always translate, even though I do that sometimes to set context for what it is you're reading in the writing, because you can't really like visualize the work from the writing. But I just try to capture the affective or emotional experience of the work, because I know I cannot capture the movement for you. Yeah.
But it becomes like a continuation of the movement.
Yeah, sort of.
An extension.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm making sense. But
No, it makes total sense because it helps audiences locate. I mean, it's interesting when looking at the synopsis for Reviser, there's 3 or 4 critics' responses to the work first, and then it's the synopsis because, which I find really interesting, but it does help me locate, this is what another audience member, thought when they met the work. Yeah.
There's one of my favorite moments in the Reviser, which I watched last night, is the subject is moved. Yes, and for those of you who haven't watched it, I strongly recommend. Like,
there are still tickets available.
Look for that
tonight.
particular moment, like the subject is moved. I think it answers like your question as well, and then it reminds me of the conversation we had I think 2 weeks ago, like preparing for this roundtable, and I was thinking of like when we all lived in the caves, like and then probably the men like would go out and hunt for like big animals, the bisons or buffaloes, and then they would bring back like to the caves and feed all the people like in the caves and the cave neighbors as well, and then they would tell a narrative of how they killed this animal, this heroic deed, right? And then they would use a lot of movements, right? The physical movements, and then there might be some kind of spoken language as well. And then afterwards, they would further record this, like on the wall of the cave, and that's a prehistoric cave painting for you. So you see, like originally, like from the beginning, they're all together, like this visual art and this performing arts, and in the end, it's communication. Sometimes we think of like dance or theater or visual arts as art, as culture, but then it's communication, right? So I think whatever means that are available to you, you use it like to communicate like your ideas to the audience, because you have to communicate like your ideas to the audience, and you have to make sure that all the means. Right, whether it's words or it's a physical movement or it's a music or visual arts. I think that's important for contemporary like artists like to think of. Notwithstanding, the structure of the educational system that we have like here in this region. Yeah.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yes, the microphone is coming to you.
Hi, thanks for the conversation so far. I'm going to preface that I think by talking, and so this is going to be a very, very messy question, but I think something that I've been thinking about with dance theatre and I guess also with musicals is what is the moment at which the performer or the character, I suppose, is moved, right, to dance or to speak. And I think what you were saying just now about communication, right? What is the choice of the character to do either one or both, or I suppose the slippages between what they are saying and what they are doing. And I think I'm just kind of curious to hear people's thoughts on how do you think about the decision of how movement or text or light, right? And what I found deeply interesting about the post-show yesterday for Reviser was the idea of there is a regime of language that under which there is movement. And you talk about the idea of like wanting the movement to overthrow the regime of language, right? And I kind of have a general question about the kind of negotiation of text and movement and other staging devices, I suppose, and then a more specific question, I think, for Reviser in terms of the decision to have the whole in the middle, and then to go back to Act 4 of the farce, right? At what point does the revolution of movement fail, and then go back to somehow language again? Something like that, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it felt like we had to obey the play. The play had to come to an end. But we also needed to, or wanted to, open up the possibility for something else within it. So we wanted to stage the inspection, and we also wanted the opening to close again. We wanted that farce to return. It had to. We didn't have a choice in the matter. We only had that one opportunity in the middle to try to let something out. Word must get out is sort of one of the driving forces within it. But it would be kind of a fantasy to say, well, it's going to go away and we get to do away with the ending. Or at least that's the obstacle we set for ourselves. Of course, at the end of the play, also language does something totally different when it comes out of the mouth of the postmaster, and it does become a kind of revolutionary force. I mean, it's kind of monstrous, too. It's extremely destructive. And we see that person driven into something dangerous because he has been, for his whole life, certainly through during the course of the play, he's been holding on to the language that he has been ingesting to the point where he can't anymore, and he's destroyed by it. And he's also one of the people at the end who is left in that frozen tableau, and the only person who is free of that is the one who never speaks. I mean, we're exploring these things also without trying not to sort of impose like a value judgment on this stuff too. Like, I don't think it's saying language is the oppressive regime and movement is the sort of pure force of freedom. It's more just looking at the forces and seeing how we can create drama by putting them together and seeing how they negotiate the terrain of the stage. And because that's sort of where drama is found, I guess, in those forces which need to cohabitate and also are sometimes at odds with one another.
Sorry, maybe a very brief response. I think it's also because, at least in Singapore's context, it feels like text can sometimes overtake movement. So the moment you have a piece of text, immediately people are like, oh, what's the meaning? And something that I've been discovering through exploring these kinds of more hybrid ways of performance is that oftentimes, in a way, the movement has to be much stronger and to pull back the text in order for the both to kind of feel equally important and relevant, right? And the danger of having narrative kind of take over and then people are like, oh, but then, so that's just something else.
It changes the way you read a piece entirely, and language has that way of becoming concrete. You know, these words have their concrete meaning. And I think that's the terrain the show is sort of exploring and succeeding at and failing at, you know, I think.
In response to that, and when I was watching a Reviser yesterday, I was also reminded of a work by Japanese playwright and theater director Toshiki Okada, whose work is coming to SIFA later this month. his plays are like very wordy. Okay, so it's a play. I mean, you can read it in dramatic literature classes, but you would not enjoy it because you have to watch the actual performance, and then his performers, and most of them are theater trained. Okay, they would have some kind of movements that are not necessarily relevant to the text. So, for example, if I do this, it's not really like relevant to what I'm doing, but it's exactly what they want to do at that particular moment. So like in this case, the text take over, but then again, you see that kind of like movement that are ingrained in the work as well. And interestingly, his works have been presented by dance festivals in Europe, even though it's playwriting. It's a play. You need to read it. Yeah. So I think that's another example. Yeah. So again, yeah, we even though we're talking about it, like this balance between movement and text and everything. So but sometimes it's the imbalance, right? That can be like a beauty, like of it as well. Because in life, it's just not always balanced, right? Yeah.
And there's certainly no drama in balance. The balance has to be upset in order for drama to occur. Yeah. The buffalo has to be killed. Yeah.
It's like we need another roundtable on listening to dance.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there's a question.
You've described the process that you came to create, going from text to a revised text to movement. And we've been talking about the pull between movement and words. I wondered what you would like as a remnant of this for other people to stage in the future. Would you like? Is there a movement score, or is it the text, the words that you came up with? What is the best remnant, if you like, but for other people to restage this work?
Yeah, certainly Reviser, you could read that script and stage your own version. I'm totally fascinated by dance, though, and how that's passed on. Like pre-video.
It's
Yeah.
Laban.
Yeah.
Rudolph Laban,
The
Labanation.
notations, right? But before that, it was just it's just person to person to person to person, right?
Yeah.
There's no other way.
It's no other way.
It was really interesting. I was with the Martha Graham Company, and they were restaging one of their own works, and one of the dancers was actually the notation didn't help expand it. The video didn't help really expand the intention that the dancer should have. And I was watching the movement director say, "No, look at this breath, this breath." So it was the remnant was actually the training of breath in order to understand the video of the movement. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So yours would be the script would be the remnant? Would be the thing that could be taken.
Yeah, I mean, and then there's
forward?
that interesting thing. Would my play Reviser be of any interest as a text? You know, would it hold up? I don't think so. I mean, and I think I maybe would have failed if it does. You know, like that it can stand on its own without the movement means that it hasn't succeeded as a true hybrid. Certainly the text for Betroffenheit doesn't hold up. It really just is this little thing which is entirely dependent on the movement. I mean, I guess it holds up as a fragment, maybe, but I think it really needs to be in concert with that other half of itself in order to live, I think.
So then your ideal combination for future performers would be, say, a video of the movement plus the text?
I think so. Or like it would be the text and Renée. Renée shows up to the new company and she has the text, and then it's rebirthed.
That would be so wonderful on Amazon, like getting the script, and then you turn up, here is your script, let's go through it.
Yeah. You pop out of the box. Yeah.
The best present, can we organise that? The most expensive thing on Amazon, I think it would be. We have time for one more question. Okay.
I think I will combine my question. I have two questions. Which is the first one is, why is the intervention of spoken word or spoken text is much more important in reviser? And also, what will happen if there's no spoken text or spoken words? Have you experienced how you transmit information to the audience during the process, or to the dramaturgs, for example, without the spoken text or spoken words? Something like that. Yeah. Thank you.
And so the question is...
So I think, during the process, did you take the text out? I think this ties back to what you were saying before. If the text and body are saying the same thing, then it becomes one of them becomes redundant. Mm-hmm. How did you explore in the rehearsal room a period where the text was taken, the voiceover was taken out, and the body spoke for itself?
Definitely not during the farce sections. We began saying, this is an obstacle we are placing on the show. We're starting here. We have to find our way through this language to get to this opening where the body begins to speak. And then gradually I started imposing text on that, trying to keep up with it. And in that zone, for sure, there were points where we took a whole bunch out at a certain point, because it was almost like a kind of fatigue sets in at a certain point where this language is describing everything that we're watching. Like, I think we could only sort of take so much of that, and we definitely pushed it to the extreme. But no, we knew in advance that this text is something, this apparatus that we are going to be moving within. And that was just sort of the conditions we began with.
While we were building movement for the middle section, mm-hmm. there's something that Crystal likes to do to generate movement, just as its own thing, where she will sort of examine or distill what's going on in the relationship between the characters, and she'll describe it in a new, very, very simple way. And she'll ask us to generate images or movement or improvised sequences with each other that have these elements. Like, I'm trying to think of an example. She gave us a sheet of paper with a list of directives that sort of contain her own very simple description
of like a rescue.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
things
right.
like this.
Yeah.
So build 3 images of rescue with your
mm-hmm.
partner.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll generate movement like this. And so that is coming out of the text in a way, but sort of like 3 steps removed.
Yeah, or retranslating a scene we have seen in the first half, which was all about dialogue, people in a dialogue, then taking that out and looking at it purely physically, and then kind of eroding it, mm-hmm. or essentializing it or something like that, so that there is a stripping away there.
Corrie wants me to be very democratic, and because you also put your hand up, you get the last question. The microphone is coming.
Okay, so we've been speaking a lot about like how dance have been manifested through text, or text, taken as the source point. But I was wondering, like, because most text is from live into text and then adapted into dance. But what about the other way? Have you all done anything where text was adapted from dance, that was adapted through live, and skipping the writing part? Because I think most of the time when we do dance, it's from text as a source material, But have you seen the other way, where dance is the source material and text is created from that, and then without text before that, Yeah.
I mean, because my role in the company is now outside looking in, and I'm on this tour not because I'm performing. I'm just here for the roundtables, but it's also because when I'm watching them rehearse, and we're thinking about a new piece, I'm just watching how they interact and who they are and how they move in the rehearsal room and how they go from moving something and then talking amongst themselves about what they just did. So in a way, what I'm thinking about now is how they are moving. And so in a way, it is the origin for these language ideas that I get from it that turn into notes, that then turn into dialogue, which then get imposed back on the movement. So there is a kind of loop there.
Okay. Please join me in thanking our panel members.